Hello and welcome to another edition of Don't Shout at the Telly. I'm your host, Martha Yankee. Today we're joined by Karl Sharro, writer, political commentator on the Middle East and architect. We'll be discussing the military coup in Egypt, and over to you, Karl.
Thanks, Martha. I want to lay the ground for our discussion with a bit of background. What happened in Egypt 2.5 years ago, which followed the uprising in Tunisia, was quite a transformative event. For me, it was clearly a case of those old regimes were completely collapsing. They didn't represent anything anymore. They were hollowed out. And there was an opportunity. There was a vacuum that said to various people, we can go out there and try to shake the system. And that was a very positive thing. But the problem starts from the very beginning. What was celebrated about those uprisings was to become precisely the problem with them. So we heard a lot, particularly from Western media, that those uprisings didn't have a specific political platform or ideology. They were not organized, and the word that was celebrated a lot was that they are leaderless and that they are organic. And that's all well and fine. But in the aftermath of the exit of the President Mubarak, for example, in Egypt, we started to discover that it's precisely those qualities, the lack of clear political ideas, the lack of vision, the lack of organization, became a liability. Now we see some elections and we see some political movement, and who's the most obvious winner of that is the Islamists, and particularly in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood. They're organized, they do charity work, they can connect with people. They win the elections, and what happens after that is we start to see, it's a bit of a problematic term, but the seculars, it's a generic word to describe all the liberals, the leftists, and other forces in Egyptian society that were not so organized. They are reeling from these victories, and they aren't able to organize themselves and come to represent an alternative to the Islamists, a new way of doing politics and talking about the economy and talking about a new vision for the society. And therefore, this period of confusion that normally follows revolutions is particularly problematic because there isn't any alternative, clear alternative to the Islamists. And then there's a sense of that the Muslim Brotherhood and President Mohammed Morsi, who took power in Egypt, are not quite competent. And to cut a long story short, there's a very wide sense of disgruntlement. This all culminates into what gets known as the 30th of June movement or protest. And there's a plan kind of build up towards that moment to say, we're fed up with the Muslim Brotherhood and we want the president to either step down or find out some kind of political outcome. Now, as the world was watching from the outside, this seemed to be the story. But quickly, the military steps in and gives an ultimatum to the president. And I think we all know what happens after that. The president rejects the ultimatum. The military effectively, in a coup, as much as people would like to deny it, deposes the president, puts him under arrest, shuts down several television stations of the Islamists, and declares a new transitional period towards what they claim is democracy. Now, let's be very clear about that. That was a military coup that didn't represent legitimate aspirations of the Egyptian people, and there's a sense of betrayal of the values of revolution and the values of progressive politics by the liberals and other secular forces in Egyptian society when they go and embrace this military coup. And they say this represents a form of revolutionary legitimacy. The army is standing with the people and is giving us what we want. Absolutely not. This was a genuine moment of betrayal. It was subsequently known as the Arab Spring or the Arab Uprising. This was the moment when you should have stuck to your principles and said the core legitimacy here should be about democracy, the formal mechanism of understanding what the opinion or the political choices of the Egyptian people are, and those are represented through elections. It's not about going back to the authority of the people who ultimately have the guns, the military.
I'd like to ask how you would define Islamism, and do you think it's inherently undemocratic as well?
The term in itself has become very confusing because it can include a range that stretches all the way from Al-Qaeda on one extreme to very moderate parties that you can see even in Egypt and in Tunisia and other places, and that are willing completely to play by the democratic game. But I think in terms of their legitimacy and arguing that they are fundamentally undemocratic, this was used particularly to justify the repression post-3rd of July and the army intervention to say, because those people don't believe in democracy, democratic rules don't apply to them. And there's a parallel between that and far-right parties in Europe, which I personally oppose and detest, but we cannot take away their right to participate in the public arena in political contestation as long as they are respecting the laws. That argument was parodied in Egypt, and you see some really facile, meaningless arguments likening Morsi, for example, to Hitler, which for anyone who has studied history at all, that's a completely offensive and useless argument. Or a sense of propaganda to say that because they are Islamists, then they reject democracy, then democratic rules don't apply to them, so we are right in kind of taking power away from them, or reversing the result of a popular election in which, to mention two examples, the presidential election they had won by 51%, in the parliamentary elections, which doesn't get talked about a lot, they had won 2/3 of the vote, and then they were cancelled. The parliament was cancelled. It was abolished, and nobody kind of mentions that particular episode. So they obviously have a very large constituency. Now, if you want to respect the rules of political contestations, you say you have to respect something very important, which is the freedom of association. You can't force people or parties or entities to be inclusive in the widest sense. You have to allow them to make whatever choices they want to make. You can criticize that. You can say that they are sectarian. You can make an appeal to other parts of society to say, let's reject that message. That message is not productive. Let's oppose it. But you cannot use undemocratic means to kind of remove them from power. And I think, to me, that is the very crucial message about what's happening there in Egypt. I myself, I believe in secular politics, but secular politics have to be built from the bottom up.
During the reign of Mubarak, there wasn't the ability for young people to have their say politically. So I was watching a news broadcast recently, and they said that 70% of Egypt's population is under the age of 30, which is very young. Do you think that this is why the revolution has come to play within the last 2 years, because the young people are starting to want to have their say politically?
The concept of democracy as a whole is very much like a Western creation, if you like. Do you think that it's something that can be applied to all countries across the globe simultaneously in the same sense that we use it? Or do you think that we have to kind of not make accommodations, but understand that different countries run on either tribal lines or religious lines, and these factions do often play quite a major role in politics? So do you think that democracy itself, as how we apply it in our current everyday lives, can actually be applied to all these other countries, including Egypt?
I just want to know your personal reaction to Tony Blair's statement that Egypt is not ready for democracy.
Do you feel the West are backing this coup because it supports the West's interests rather than the interests of the Egyptian people?
I think I really have to start with Tony Blair's question about Tony Blair, because he's utterly the most despicable person ever to speak on the subject, or any subject for that matter, ever, including football. And the man is really completely without principles, but his desire to almost enshrine this completely unprincipled approach into a form of politics is even more despicable. And I think what he said about Egypt, which relates to this question I'm going to come back to, is a betrayal more of the Western position rather than anything that is happening within Egypt itself. There is actually genuine hunger for democracy in Egypt. People are really thirsty for that. It so happens there are certain elites that, as any other country in the world, it's against their interest to allow full democratization, and it's something that we saw in Europe in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And let's not forget, we still see it all the time. We have a body like the European Union that often goes and asks people in a referendum, and if they give them the wrong answer, then they go and ask them again. So this authoritarian drive exists across the board, and that's kind of where I want to segue back into that point, that there is democracy isn't owned by anybody. It's the culmination of ideas that developed over centuries. Maybe it is achieved its higher forms organizationally in some Western countries, but we can't say it's suitable for one country and not suitable for other countries. And I think if you actually actually go and talk to a lot of Arabs today, they feel that a genuine transition to democracy would allow them to express themselves better, to dissociate themselves from older forms of doing politics, inherited forms of doing politics, and that would be in itself a liberating form. So when people say, for example, about tribal bonds and things like that, and some people go, some cultural relativists would actually celebrate that, they often forget that there are things that are not voluntary. You are born with them. So blood ties or tribal ties or any form of kind of cultural ties, they are not things that you choose. So by definition, they are not things that will allow you to express yourself or work for a different form of social organization or to kind of allow society to become more dynamic. They are coercive and they are in themselves kind of inherited from the past. So that's a very important distinction, and I feel that people sometimes tend to ignore that when looking at this. They're saying, oh, it's all fine and well for the West to want democracy, but this is not suitable for our society. That, in my personal view, is completely wrong. But I think here we need to be also more careful, because what is the desire behind that? Why do we need a democratic system? Why do we need a system in which people's voices are heard more equally? It's in order to demolish the institutions and the inherited kind of bonds that limit us all from achieving our potential. And you see it particularly in places, let's say, like Saudi Arabia, in the subjugated position of women. We see that women aren't allowed to work, aren't allowed to, except in very limited capacity, aren't allowed to drive a car, aren't allowed to be in the public sphere in the same way like men are. So society is forcefully being deprived from the potential of half of its population. And you have many, many bright women that are not allowed to express themselves, work in the jobs that they won't have very basic freedoms. You can either say, well, this is tradition, and that's how we do things and forget about it. Or you can say this system is completely wrong and it's time to change it. And that's my feeling about this conception of democracy and giving people the freedom to transform themselves and their society, and the trap of saying, you know, that cultural relativistic take, they say it's fine for the West, but it's not good for us. And I'm afraid that's been played a lot, particularly in the case of Egypt, to say, and it was particularly shocking for me that you have leading liberal leaders in Egypt make the point that because there's 30% of the population in Egypt are illiterate, then either they shouldn't be given the vote. This is in the 21st century, in voices that consider themselves at the head of a transition toward democracy, that illiterate people either shouldn't be given the vote, or we should have a different system of democracy where their kind of votes don't count as much as literate people. And this is, to me, the kind of an expression of how conservative those forces that pretend to be secular, pretend to be liberal, are. You know, and also that they are genuinely afraid. They have a problematic relationship with the Egyptian people. Those elites, those people who have this hatred of the average people. So those people are in their interest to say we can't apply democracy like it's applied in the West, because it's taken the West centuries to develop and that kind of thing, to justify the most coercive, elitist policies. The West's position on Egypt. There is something very intriguing there, because in those last 2.5, 3 years, it seems that the United States in particular has lost sight of what represents a real strategic interest in the Middle East. So it tends to kind of come up with completely irrational policies and sometimes contradictory policies, but it was quite clear it's completely devoid of any real meaningful sense of interest, but it's also devoid completely of any sense of principle. A coup happens in Egypt, and there are laws and rules in the United States that say if a coup takes place, an undemocratic coup takes place, then the United States is not allowed by law to supply any more aid to that country. So the US administration goes out of its way to say that this is not a coup, so as not to become obliged not to provide aid to Egypt. And by the way, Egypt gets a substantial amount of aid from the United States that goes predominantly to its army. So you can understand a little bit of the dynamic that's happening over there. So you get all these mixed messages. It's not clear whether they're actually with or against the coup, or knew about it or didn't know about it. And if you had looked 30 years ago, no coup would have happened without the US giving its explicit authorization, if not organizing it itself. So we're moving into this area now where the actual control of the United States of events on the ground is actually slipping, but the extent of kind of saying that we still represent democracy and all that kind of thing is still very magnified, and you hear a lot about that time. But when the opportunity comes to say, take a principled stance, say we're not going to deal with undemocratic government, they simply don't come through.
Sort of far be it for me to agree with Tony Blair on sort of any level, but also it was mentioned earlier about the percentage of Egyptians and a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, how high a percentage of their population is under the age of 30, and it's almost like a lost generation, and this weird generation where they've seen democracy and they've glimpsed it and they've gone out and they've tried to get it. So it's not so much that they're not capable of democracy, it's that they're so passionately fighting for it, it is driving them away from it, almost in this weird paradoxical sense.
What do you see as the way forward now? How do we get ourselves out of this situation where the military is in control, and where half of the people do believe that the military did them some sort of a favour? Do you think that an election in the future, would it be respected?
I want to ask you if you think a transition can occur in Egypt, because a transition can only occur through civil cohesion and inclusion, and in Egypt we now see an increasing deepening of a dichotomy and polarization between the Egyptian population of the pro-Morsi and anti-Morsi supporters.
You mentioned that there's 30% of the population is illiterate, so whether it's in Egypt's best interest to have a long-term plan to educate people so that they can filter in political education at a younger age, so that they can engage in the political process in the future and strive towards a democracy, if that is what everyone wants.
Just on the point of the illiteracy, I think it's unfair to assume that people that are illiterate don't engage in politics, and organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and other parties know how to connect with them and how to talk to their aspirations. So, of course, it's necessary for every country to completely educate all its population, but I wouldn't say that's a precondition for a healthy form of politics, and this is the danger that some people in Egypt the trap that they fall into, that if someone is illiterate then they are not capable of making the right political choices. I would separate the two. Of course everybody needs to be educated, but it doesn't mean that in the current state their political choices are wrong. There is this sense, actually, from everyone, observers from the outside and some of the people involved with the coup or Egyptian politics, is it's a done deal, let's move on, let's speed up the transition to democracy. But that runs the risk of ignoring two things. One, it sets a very dangerous precedent, what happened, that's going to be very detrimental to democracy in the future of Egypt. Two, there is still an ongoing struggle by the Muslim Brotherhood. So there is this stumbling block, which is not an easy one. How do you then go about disbanding this and convincing the Muslim Brotherhood to accept a fait accompli, something that has been done, and to sort of accept throwing them out of power, knowing that the plan is, look at the dynamics of politics in Egypt. If another elections happen, parliamentary elections, the Muslim Brotherhood will still going to win it. So we're looking at down the road is what probably the military and some of the politicians on their side will do is they disqualify the Muslim Brotherhood from running in the next election in one shape or the other. So we're looking at an even more crooked basis for a transition to democracy. The important point for me is to say, no, what happened is wrong and shouldn't have been done this way, and shouldn't have set this precedent of the military intervening whenever anybody can bring people on the street. What happens if this were to happen again in a year's time and the president happens to be a liberal? Would you accept it then? You've established the military as an arbiter, and that's not an aspect you should accept. Your defense is to go back to basics and go back to principles and go back to the rules of the democratic game. What should have happened here is for the Muslim Brotherhood to be ejected from office by the people. And I was fairly confident that that was going to happen, because if they had been left to run Egypt for 4 years, they would have completely showed their incompetence and lack of vision. And unfortunately, what has happened might give them a lifeline now, might give them a renewed sense of purpose. So I think when we think about the next step, we shouldn't become this kind of pragmatic, accepting an unusual situation, which say, no, we have to stick to the principles of democracy.
But you say if they'd been left for 4 years, they would have shown themselves up. But the argument seems to be is that they were hell-bent on destroying democracy, and that's what the army says, and that's what a lot of liberals say. So, you know, there might not have been in 4 years' time, there might have been a Muslim dictatorship.
I agree with the idea that military intervention does undermine democracy, but I question why should citizens wait years to unelect corrupt politicians, and shouldn't a hands-on approach be taken?
I don't really understand why all this hasn't motivated them to get politically organised and organise their campaign in order to win an election.
Don't you think the youth have relied too much on the West to represent them ideologically and organisationally, and they've lacked the vision and cohesion with them, which is why they haven't succeeded through their protests?
Also, in terms of the dream, the Egyptian dream for democracy, do you think we need to tell them that in terms of a representative democracy, there has to be a tyranny of a majority? So there has to be the majority being in power, because the electorate has to vote someone into power, and someone has to have more votes than the other. And I think this is something that they're missing, because it goes back to the fact that maybe the problem isn't the representative democracy, the problem is the Egyptian people. There's no harmony within them, so there's a big divide in the society as a whole. So when there is someone representing them, there's such a big divide in what they think and how they work with each other. Is that the issue?
And also, I think that people need to accept the pros and cons of democracy, and the con would be that not everybody is going to agree with you, and there are going to be disagreements, but then the pros are that you can organise and protest and hopefully change people's opinions and change the political structure.
I mentioned before that there was a parliament elected, the lower house, and it was abolished. So Egypt has been without a parliament for more than a year. And there were upcoming elections within a few months. It wasn't going to last for 4 years. And that would have been the opportunity for the secularists, which is a very misleading term, but it just broadly means everyone who's not an Islamist, who's opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, to organize themselves and then try to win these elections or make advances in these elections that would give them some legitimacy, build on their constituency and move them forward. So there was that potential, which they spurned and opted for something else. Now, the point was raised quite correctly that you don't have to wait for 4 years for someone if they're completely wrecking the country. There are always what I would call direct democracy, and organizing millions of people to come out on the street is a manifestation of direct democracy. Now, where did it go wrong? It went wrong at the moment when that became about an authorization for the military to do what it did. If you genuinely had a revolutionary agenda, and you brought out the people on the street, and you wanted to force the president out and start something new, then you wouldn't hand over to the old authority, which is represented by the army. You would actually split the army. That would be the moment of contention where you would force low-ranking officers and soldiers to abandon the leadership and to literally kind of implode that institutions from within. Now, what happened instead was a sort of coexistence with the army. Not only that, by ceding their authority to the authority of the army. I mean, some of the things that were said were absolutely shocking. It looked like the glorification that Hitler or Stalin used to get, you know, in terms of the poster of the leader of the army and all of that. So I think there was an opportunity for revolutionary politics that they missed because they're completely incompetent in terms of organization and a political message, and there was an opportunity to actually organize themselves in an election moving forward and say we're going to try to win these on the back of the failures of the Muslim Brotherhood, and none of these happened.
How can you expect them to actually know how to do it? They've always been ruled, they've always been submissive, you know. How is a whole country worth of people, especially the young people, who that's all they've ever known, that life, know how to even begin? And the other thing is, isn't this the part that we're meant to be helping with, rather than kind of helping with all the military stuff? Shouldn't this be the thing that, you know, the educated Western world should be, you know, trying to help with, actually, that side of things? And how would you suggest that we could go about that, if you think it was possible?
I don't think it's for the West to help in this respect, because I think it's very important that the Egyptian people decide their own vision of how they want their country to be ruled. But maybe that it's not necessary to be so pessimistic about the future for them, because we could see this as kind of trial and error. I mean, they had an election. The President Morsi, who the majority of the people wanted, was elected. Didn't turn out so great. But what's that to say for the next time? It won't make people smarter about their choices.
How do people feel broadly about this question of the Western role?
I think they've already played a big role, because you could see that the negative effects of them funding the military, because they have been involved already. The question is not what they should do, but rather what they should stop doing.
I think if they keep getting involved, then these countries will start to depend on them rather than learning how to fend for themselves. And so I think the best thing to do is to just let Egypt sort out its own problems instead of looking to the West.
I think just remembering back 2 years or so when the Arab uprising started, it was a wave of optimism through Europe. In a sense, it's almost the opposite to what you say, because there's a disillusionment with democracy over here.
If you were an Egyptian and you lived there and think of it from both sides, what would you do? I wouldn't know the right way forward, and to be honest, when you've been led for so long, how do people really know how to lead?
I would actually do it the other way around. I would learn from the Egyptians and try to do what they did over here.
Very true. They've got something we don't have, which is a passion to get what they want, and perhaps they're not wanting to compromise. But I think we in this country have compromised far too much.
We act as if they would desire the socio-economic system we live under, but who's to say democracy is the right form? I mean, if you look around the Western countries, they don't seem to be thriving on a mass scale. It's just rather the ruling classes who are benefiting from these crashes in the economy. And is it really something they should aspire towards? Shouldn't they be looking at different forms of modelling society that's not based on the cyclical consumption and the economic drive for constant growth, and it's more about how we organise technically our society in order to provide people with an abundance of what everybody would agree with, which is a healthy form of living.
You look at a country like Egypt now, what it's suffering from is not overproduction or overconsumption, it's actually suffering from underproduction. So you see that on all aspects of life. There's a lot of poverty, there's a shortage in housing. Millions of Egyptians have to immigrate to Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries to work. Whereas, in theory, Egypt should have all the components to make it a thriving country that could feed all its citizens. And the question would be there, how to join up that model with the political model. I'm sometimes shocked that people think what's happening, like the economic crisis and things like that, are actually down to democracy. And I think it's actually down to an absence of democracy. But you have to understand democracy not as, again, this set of technical rules, but as a sense of participation, as in your voice being heard and being heard vigorously enough to shape the future of your society. You take that back onto Egypt, when there are millions of unemployed people or people who have to work in really underpaid jobs, getting the minimum wage, no rights whatsoever in many Arab countries. Those people deserve to have an economy that's productive enough, not only to give them the minimum, but to actually give them an affluent lifestyle. And here I want to challenge you with a problem with Egyptian liberals, is actually they tend to regard people not as a potential, but as a liability. Their constant complaint is there are simply far too many people in Egypt. Yeah? And it's kind of almost a resurgence of this old Malthusian idea that if Egyptians were to have fewer kids and children, then everything would be okay. And that's actually a very dangerous proposition. I would argue the other way around is it's your failure as elites to organize the system to give enough to these people, and the fact that you kind of control more of the political system and the economic system that deprives those people. It's not the fact there are far too many people in Egypt. It's a question of frame of mind, and I think it's kind of aversion to humanity and thinking too many people is a dangerous thing, whereas probably for me, it's not probably, it's the more the merrier.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if you think we're not necessarily in a position to tell them how to elect a government or whatever, because perhaps our own democracy in the UK has ceased to evolve, and so we're not necessarily in the place to tell them what to do.
And do you think the doctrine of state sovereignty is actually being got into play here.
I just wondered whether you think the US has got any right to intervene any more than it has already, and whether you think they should pull out their aid that they're funding Egypt with.
Also, do you think that there is anyone in place at the moment, whether they're a fledgling group or whether they're established, who actually can step up to the fold, and whether they can actually do anything productive?
I think the key words I want to pick up on, it's a nice way to wrap up, is ideas like intervention and sovereignty, and I want to tie them back to what I started talking about, which is self-determination. Because I think sovereignty on the state level is a manifestation of that self-determination, the idea that when you live in a state, it gives expression to who you are as a citizen, and it's the field that you can influence. It's where your politics is meaningful. So in a way, what we're discussing over here doesn't affect our lives. It's almost like an intellectual exercise, but for Egyptians, it's a matter of lived reality. And I sincerely hope that in terms of the attitude towards America or other entities trying to work their way into Egypt, that needs to stop, and that Egyptians can develop the self-confidence to reject that. What we need to re-inspire, and particularly what Arab people themselves to be re-inspired by, is the idea that this is down to them. You know, all this sense that waiting for the world to do something or intervention, that goes again the very idea of having an uprising and trying to alter the political system that you live in. So despite this setback that we have seen in Egypt, I think ultimately there is a sense of spirit and of a possibility and of hope that will overcome that, and will say enough with this form of authoritarian politics, and we'll find another way. And I'm confident that within a few years we'll see Egyptians back on the streets trying to put this back on track.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank Karl for joining us for what was actually a very inspiring discussion. Please feel free to leave your comments at the bottom of this video, or alternatively, if you have something you wish to discuss on Don't Shout at the Telly, please email us.